Grab some popcorn and a favorite chair. The love of movies is why we're here. Press play and don't delay. Let Phil be our guide to a cinematic day. Phil at the movies, from the silver screen to his podcast stream. Phil's covering every movie dream. Phil at the movies. Phil at the movies.
And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Phil at the Movies. I'm your host, Phil Walsh, and you are listening to show number 173 of this ongoing podcast that is, you guessed it, for the love of movies. And today I'm going to be talking with you about the new film by Ari Aster, Eddington. This is a neo-Western movie that boldly dissects America in 2020 and puts the psyche, if you will, our collective psyche, under the microscope. And I have a lot to say about this film, but in short, I would go so far as to say I liked it, might even say I loved it, which was not my initial thought going into the film, because I had heard just through various reviews and takes that the film was likely to be divisive, to say the least. But this is certainly a film for the moment, and I will have plenty to say in just a little bit. But at this point, if you could rate and review this podcast on Apple, helps a great deal with growing the audience, getting us into many more people's podcast feeds, and enhancing this cinematic community that we have been building together for the last 3 years. And at that point, of course, let me just say thank you to you, the listeners, you, the friends of Phil at the Movies, because this would not be possible without all of you. And I mean it when I say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am grateful to each and every one of you who takes the time to listen to this show, to engage with it, and to share your love of movies with me. Now, one bit of movie news to share with you. As you may recall, I am somewhat of a fan when it comes to the films of Christopher Nolan. I have said from time to time that he is my favorite director. May have mentioned that in passing. And I have mentioned on occasion that I am eagerly awaiting the release of his new film, The Odyssey, which, as of this recording, is now 365 days away. By the time you hear this episode, we'll be at 364. So we've crossed the Rubicon. We have crossed the threshold, ladies and gentlemen. 1 year to go. Under a year, the time is moving on, time marches on, and we are one day closer to the release of The Odyssey. And this week, we really felt that excitement, not only because we crossed the 1 year mark, but the film, yes, the film, has already made around $1.5 million from pre-sales to the IMAX 70mm screenings for the film, a full year ahead of release. Now you're saying to yourself probably, what do you mean? Well, for those of you who may not know, this week, pre-sales for The Odyssey in 70mm IMAX went on sale. And no surprise, they have practically sold out nationwide. That boggles the mind, but it doesn't boggle the mind, because number one, as was seen with the success of Oppenheimer, which also had a showing both in IMAX and in 70mm, people would buy out tickets weeks, if not a month or two in advance, to see the film on that pristine format. Number one, people want to experience a film in that quality and that kind of experience. And number two, that is the power of Christopher Nolan. He is arguably the only director that can command that kind of attention, that kind of power for his films. Again, to have a pre-sale for a movie that is going to be released in a year, and to have them practically sell out. Now, granted, there's not hundreds and hundreds of IMAX or 70 millimeter IMAX theaters or screens, but there's a good handful, if you will, maybe more than a handful across the country in various markets. To have it sell out, that just illustrates the excitement for this film. Now, I have seen a few chuckleheads online decry this decision to sell pre-sale tickets one year in advance. And some people said, "Oh, this is terrible. It's horrible for the medium, and it's turning movies into a concert-like event. No, it's terrible, terrible." And I feel like you can't have it both ways. You can't sit there and trumpet the theatrical experience, but then pout and cry because you don't like the way the experience is being marketed or presented. Whether folks want to admit it or not, movies as a medium, the theatrical experience, has become an event. People, and I'm talking about general audiences, want to be a part of something. They want to feel like they're getting a bang for their buck. That's why you see places like the Alamo Drafthouse do extremely well, because people are willing to pay a little bit more in order to have an experience at the movies that is more than just simply going to the movie. And I think that is the only way that this medium survives, is if it becomes a true event. It gives people a reason to go to the theater, to leave their house. COVID, if you will, has conditioned people to think, well, I'll just wait for it to be on streaming in a couple of weeks. And that is ultimately shortchanging the theatrical experience. So as much as some people may cry about this, oh, it's horrible, how dare they make movies feel like a concert pre-sale, this is the way of the future. And it is the way I think that movie theaters will survive and endure. You have to have it be an event. It also stands to reason that big event movies, and I'm not just talking about the Odyssey, but big event movies, comic book movies, certainly Marvel, because they've been labeled, a lot of criticisms have been lobbed at them over the years. But these big event movies keep the lights on for theaters. And that's important, because if the lights are on at these theaters, that means that smaller independent films can also be put on these screens, and that gets them in front of more people's eyes. So it is a win-win as far as I'm concerned. But yes, I already have my ticket 1 year in advance for the Odyssey. I'll be seeing it in 70 millimeter IMAX. So I'm, of course, already on board the hype train. As again, I've said time and again, this is a Christopher Nolan centric podcast, but it's fun. It's fun that there's just this excitement for this movie. And again, I can't think of another director today that commands that sort of attention and power when it comes to his movies. But again, that's the power of Christopher Nolan. He makes damn good films, and he said in an interview recently, and I don't have the full quote in front of me, but he said every time he makes a movie, he makes it because he wants it to be the best film he has made. That's the mentality. I'm paraphrasing, but he goes into each film wanting it to be the very best it can be, thinking it will be the best film he's made thus far. And I think that's why his films have staying power. That's why his films connect with audiences, not only here, but around the world. But there we go. A little bit of Odyssey news to share with you today. We are 1 year and counting until the release of this much anticipated film. For me, this is the most anticipated film of next year. It's frankly the most anticipated film for a couple years. But I will leave you there with that subject for now. Suffice it to say, my odyssey has already begun. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, let me turn your attention to the movie Eddington. This is from director Ari Aster. He also writes the movie. It is distributed by A24 Studios, and it stars Joaquin Phoenix as Sheriff Joe Cross, Pedro Pascal as Ted Garcia, the local mayor, Emma Stone as Joe's wife Louise Cross, Austin Butler as Vernon Jefferson Peake, Luke Grimes as an officer in the sheriff's office named Guy, Michael Ward as a young sheriff trainee, plays Michael, and Deidre O'Connell as Dawn, Louise's mother. The film is set in the small town of Eddington, New Mexico, and it features a standoff between a small-town sheriff, Phoenix, and the mayor, Pascal, that sparks a powder keg as neighbor is pitted against neighbor, all against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I find it interesting that here we are in the year 2025, 5 years after this monumental and life-changing event happened. And in this time, there have been very few movies, stories, TV shows, etc., commenting or offering a commentary on what was arguably the most transformative, and in a negative sense I mean that, a transformative event in not just world history, but here in the United States, arguably since 9/11. Whether we want to admit it or not, the pandemic changed things in this country. It changed things forever. And I think certainly there is a desire to memory hole the year 2020. I think we'd love to see it left in the ash bin of history. But in a lot of ways, we can't ignore what was a seismic event, because as much as we might like to forget about it, we are still dealing and living with the ramifications and impact of that year. Again, it's been 5 years, and yet we are still dealing with the aftermath of COVID. The virus itself may be under control, but there is another virus that I think in a lot of ways is much harder to detect and therefore much harder to contain. And that's really what this film is getting at. This movie is putting the American psyche in the year 2020 under the microscope. Now, it's an Ari Aster film, so it's bold, it is a little provocative, it is over the top. But at its core, this film is trying to not necessarily analyze America in the year 2020, but trying to showcase just what happened and how essentially we all lost our collective minds in one way or another as a result of the pandemic, and how in the year 2025, 5 years removed from the start of the pandemic, we are still dealing with the aftermath. We are still wrestling with the decisions, wrestling with the ramifications of everything and anything that had to do with the pandemic. Now, the film is set right in the sort of height of it. This is in May of 2020. Lockdowns have happened, and there is a feeling of unease permeating throughout this small town called Eddington. You have the growing political divide that would certainly rupture in the summer months of 2020 and beyond over masking, social distancing, all of the policies that were put in place as a result of the pandemic. And sort of wisely, Aster brings us into this world, this story, through humor. He pokes fun at the absurdities that were going on at the time, on both sides, if you will, of the equation. You know, the concern people had about COVID-19 being in the mail, and sort of the rampant paranoia of government conspiracies and all of that. He pokes fun, if you will, at both sides. But this is not a film that is both sidesing really anything. I would argue that this film doesn't have a strict political identity, though it is an overtly political film. If you go into this movie thinking it is going to be of one persuasion or the other, I think you will be both mistaken and perhaps disappointed, because this film is not meant to be a liberal or conservative manifesto on the pandemic 5 years ago. If anything, this movie is showcasing the absurdities of everybody, of just what exactly was going on, what was going on in the air. Not necessarily the virus, if you will, called COVID-19, but a virus that has in many ways always been with the American psyche, but it took the lockdowns, it took the pandemic procedures, it took the cultural and social unrest to sort of bring about a collective nervous breakdown. And that is what is going on in this movie. There is this backdrop, if you will, of a political race between Joaquin Phoenix's character, Joe Cross, and the incumbent mayor, Ted Garcia, played by Pedro Pascal. And they both sort of represent, to varying degrees, what was going on either side of the political spectrum. Phoenix plays a much more conservative figure, someone kind of opposed to the mask mandates and the feeling that there was this encroachment of freedom. Pascal portrays a much more even-keeled, if not overzealous, elected official who is simply trying to follow mandates and maintain a sense of order. But it goes much deeper than that. The film injects an added commentary about the mixing, if you will, of business and politics, the corporatization that has been permeating our society at record pace, the infusion of digital technology, of AI, of the idea of these small towns sort of flipping overnight from being rural, quaint villages or communities into either full-on political hotbeds of discourse and discontent, or becoming a staple in the corporatization of the United States. On the flip side, with Phoenix's character, you have a somewhat naive or righteous individual, at least insofar as he believes himself to be righteous, but then at the same time somebody who is teetering on the edge of conspiracies and rabbit holes of disinformation and paranoia. And it's that through line. I mean, the movie itself represents a microcosm of what exactly was going on in the country during that year. I mean, from the racial unrest to riots, to political instability. I mean, there is a little bit of everything, where at points this film feels like a documentary. It may take on absurd points and feelings at various inflections, but it's ultimately trying to say, this is what was going on, and this is what is still going on. If anything, the movie is sort of showcasing just how far the American psyche has cracked in the last 5 years. Again, there's a character played by Austin Butler who is sort of a conspiracy theorist, snake oil salesman, if you will. And he's very much a microcosm of all of the con artists or the conspiracy theorists who have gained tremendous ground in the country over the last 4 years. I mean, think the radical podcast host and other sort of YouTube sensations that have dominated people's spheres of perception and influence. He's right there in the midst of it. You have the political unrest. You have the political corruption, the corruption of power. I mean, this is, in a lot of ways, a treatise on not just American society, but American democracy as well. But it's all tied together as a Western. And in many ways, this is a quintessential American story. We're really responsible for the dominance, if you will, of the Western genre. It is very much a mainstay of our storytelling culture, and it certainly has lost its favor. It doesn't, the heyday is past for the Western genre, but every now and again it returns in various forms. And, much like you think of a film like No Country for Old Men, not that this movie is on any similar comparison level, but insofar as it's taking the tropes and trappings that we might associate with a Western and bringing it into a modern context. So again, here you have the sheriff figure who, in a typical sort of cliched Western, would be the figure of law and order and stability, and that is completely turned on its head in this film. You have the politician who might be full-on corrupt in a typical Western setting, but here there's more complexities and shades of gray. You have, in the character of Austin Butler, you have the snake oil salesman, or in this case, the conspiracy theorist. And the fact that this movie is set in a small town, in a desert, just makes it all come together beautifully. You couldn't tell this story in suburbia. You couldn't tell it with any effect in a city. It had to be set in a small Western town. It had to have that Wild West feel, almost a cowboy adjacent tone, in order to really examine the themes going on in this story. And I think because the American Western is so associated with our cultural identity, I mean, we are, for better or for worse, still a cowboy nation at our core. This movie really is getting to that identity. It doesn't always go perhaps as far as you might think, but there is great attempt to sort of deconstruct the myth, if you will, of the Old West and the quintessential Western, and frame it in a way that is relevant to our modern society. This is an examination of the American identity as much as it is the psyche. And what I really loved about this film is it keeps you on your toes. Just when you think it's going to go one way, it zigzags. Like I said, it may start off with one particular political philosophy, but then it does a U-turn, and then it goes back, and then it zigzags again. And I think that's really underscoring the idea of this collective nervous breakdown that we as a country had 5 years ago and are still dealing with to this day. Again, if in a lot of ways, I was thinking about the new Superman movie after I left the theater tonight. And again, I wasn't a big fan of the film, but certainly there is an element of hope and aspiration embedded in that particular film, which I can acknowledge and to an extent appreciate. It is a film that rejects cynicism. And in many ways, these two films, while tonally different, again, one's a comic book movie, one is a neo-Western, I think they serve as kind of call and response to one another. And what I mean by that is, if the new Superman movie is meant to showcase and embody hope and optimism, then Eddington is holding a mirror up to ourselves, up to our society, and saying, take a good look at what you have become. And in many ways, it's almost a clarion call to step back from the brink and to not go over the edge, so to speak. Again, there's a lot going on in this movie, and it's not going to work for everybody, but I found it to be such a bold examination on just what happened to us 5 years ago. It was more than just a once-in-a-century pandemic. It was a cultural and societal shakedown in a lot of ways, a nervous breakdown on a national scale that I think a lot of ways we would probably rather just move on from and forget and kind of memory hole it. But this movie is sort of saying you can't forget it. You can't put it in the book and never look at it again. You have to reconcile with it. You have to maybe not rectify it, but you have to at least confront these demons and exorcise these ghosts. Otherwise, we're sort of trapped in this perpetual doom loop, if you will, and ultimately things just become, in some ways, like the old Wild West, where there's just chaos and disorder and everybody for themselves. I found this to be such an unexpected film, and I would go so far as to say I liked it, and I would almost say I loved it. I think it is, I think to me it's my favorite Ari Aster film, and it might be his best movie. I know that those are fighting words, because he's certainly made some compelling films, but for me, this movie was, as much as it takes an absurd approach, there's a lot of truth in this film, and I appreciate the boldness and the frank candor that Aster is giving us amidst all of the shouting and the shootouts and the over-the-top antics. I really think that he's trying to, again, not put a signature on one political side. Though, again, you could certainly read into this, I suppose, if you wanted to, in either direction. I think ultimately this movie is meant to be kind of looked at from the middle, if you will, and sort of shouting up to everybody else, stop, look at what you've done, look at where you are, look at where you've been, and look at where you could be going. And again, that's not going to work for everybody, but I found this to be a film that really is of the moment, and given that we're now half a decade since the pandemic, it really does seem like a perfect time to stop and take inventory and actually think about what happened 5 years ago. It was more than just a once-in-a-century pandemic. It was something more than that. It was something that really got into the very soul and psyche of the country. And I think that's harder to address, because that's not something you can take care of with a mask or with a vaccine. You have to really have a real discussion and an argument, if you will, both internally and externally, just for who you are, what we believe, and what kind of a people we want to be. And again, this movie is not going to work for everybody, but what Aster is working with here, really, really impactful, and it left me shaken in a way that I haven't been with a film in quite some time. It really does hit home, and it forces us to look both inward and at the world around us. And again, using the framing of a Western, which is so quintessential to the American identity, was a brilliant way to go, because it really does get at sort of the mythic nature, if you will, of America, but also kind of what is coded in our DNA going back hundreds of years at this point. I'll say I love this film. I really did. I expect to be revisiting it again and picking up different nuances on a second viewing. The performances are spectacular. Pedro Pascal is always great. Emma Stone wasn't in the film as much as I expected, but she gives such a poignant and tragic performance of somebody who's working through her own challenges and problems, and is sort of sucked down this rabbit hole of conspiracy and delusion that it's really quite tragic, and again, a microcosm of what has happened to a lot of people in this country. Phoenix is always incredible. I think this might be his best performance to date. It's at least his best performance since Joker in 2019. I just loved his complexity and the real layers of gray to his character. But all in all, Eddington is a surprise for me. Again, I had heard mixed reviews going into it, but I was glad I kept an open mind, because this is one that I think people will be talking about, and it shouldn't just be dismissed as, oh, it's an Ari Aster film and he's just being absurd in a few places, or it's all over the map and it doesn't have an identity. I think all of that is the point. There's not meant to be one political identity attached to this film. It's not meant to be a commentary on one side or the other. It is an overtly political film because it is sort of showcasing an all of the above focus. But moreover, this film is trying to get at the very idea of just what happened to the American psyche 5 years ago and how we're still dealing with it now, half a decade later. That, to me, is the power of a great movie that can sort of take a 30,000 view look at things and then really get down into the dirt and the nitty-gritty. And I think Aster has really done it here. It's provocative, but it's also reflective. So the film is Eddington. I'd recommend you checking it out if you are looking for something that is a little bit more than the usual popcorn flick, if you will. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, because God knows I love them, but this is something that definitely warrants discussion and conversation. And I had a tremendous reaction to it, but also in a way that it does leave you certainly feeling a little bit on edge at the same time. And again, that's a mark of a great film, where there's just so much to unpack, but in a provocative and reflective way. So there we go, everybody. The film is Eddington. Go check it out this weekend. And that does it for me today. I'll be back next week, where we will do this all over again for the love of movies.
Feels covering every movie dream. Feel at the movies makes every movie